In the heart of rural Texas, where the land stretched wide and the skies seemed endless, Jim lived a life many would envy. His family's ranch had been passed down through generations. Nestled in a quiet corner far from the noise of cities, it was a place where time moved slower and simplicity reigned supreme. The rolling hills were dotted with cattle grazing peacefully, while wildflowers painted the landscape in bursts of color during spring. At the heart of it all was a freshwater spring, a lifeline for the entire property. This spring fed into an intricate network of pipes that Jim used to water his crops, hydrate his animals, and keep the ranch thriving. Jim wasn't just a rancher, he was a steward of the land. Every morning, he woke up before sunrise, his boots crunching against the gravel as he walked outside. He'd check on the cattle first, making sure they were healthy and content. Then, he'd inspect the irrigation system, ensuring the water flowed smoothly to every corner of the ranch. To Jim, this water wasn't just a resource, it was sacred. It represented years of hard work, sacrifice, and care. His father had taught him how to maintain the pipelines, and now it was Jim's turn to carry the torch. Life on the ranch wasn't always easy, but it was rewarding. There was something magical about watching seeds sprout into crops or seeing calves take their first wobbly steps. Jim found joy in these small moments, cherishing the connection he felt to the earth beneath his feet. But like any good story, peace never lasts forever. One day, everything changed when Karen moved in next door. Karen was different. She arrived in a shiny SUV packed with designer bags and boxes labeled fragile. Her high heels clicked awkwardly on the dirt road leading to her new home, and her oversized sunglasses made her look more like a movie star than a ranch neighbor. Jim couldn't help but chuckle the first time he saw her struggling to carry groceries across uneven terrain. Still, he decided to give her the benefit of the doubt. After all, everyone deserves a chance to adapt to country living. At first, Karen seemed pleasant enough. She waved hello whenever she saw Jim and even brought over a plate of store-bought cookies one afternoon. Jim appreciated the gesture, though the cookies tasted suspiciously artificial compared to his grandmother's recipes. During their brief conversations, Karen mentioned how excited she was to get away from the city and live off the land. Jim nodded politely, though he doubted she truly understood what that meant. Things took a turn when Karen started asking questions about the ranch's water system. She admired how green Jim's fields stayed, even during dry spells, and wondered aloud if there was any way she could borrow some water for her own needs. Feeling generous, Jim agreed to let her use a small portion of the freshwater line in emergencies. He figured it wouldn't hurt. After all, neighbors are supposed to help each other out, right? Little did Jim know, this decision would set off a chain of events that would test his patience, challenge his values, and force him to confront the darker side of human nature. For now, however, life continued as usual. The sun rose and set over the ranch, casting golden hues across the horizon. Birds chirped in the trees, and the sound of flowing water echoed softly through the pipes. But beneath the surface of this serene existence, trouble was brewing, and soon it would spill over into chaos. It didn't take long for Jim to notice that something was off. At first, the signs were subtle, things he could easily overlook if he wasn't paying close attention. One morning, as he checked the irrigation system, he noticed the water pressure seemed lower than usual. The streams trickling into the fields weren't as strong as they had been the day before. Jim frowned but chalked it up to a possible clog in the pipes, or maybe even the effects of the ongoing drought. He spent hours inspecting the lines, tightening connections, and clearing out debris, but nothing seemed amiss. A few days later, Jim spotted something unusual while driving back from town. As he passed Karen's driveway, he slowed down, his eyes catching movement near her gleaming white Mercedes. There she was, standing in her driveway with a hose in hand, washing her car under the blazing Texas sun. But what caught Jim's attention wasn't just the fact that she was washing her car. It was how she was doing it. The hose wasn't connected to any visible water source on her property. Instead, it snaked across the ground and disappeared into the bushes, where Jim knew his freshwater line ran underground. Jim felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He parked his truck and approached Karen cautiously, trying to keep his tone friendly despite the unease bubbling inside him. "Hey, Karen," he called out, forcing a smile. "Where are you getting the water for that?" Karen barely glanced at him, her focus remaining on scrubbing a spotless windshield. "Oh, I tapped into your line," she said casually, as if admitting to borrowing a cup of sugar. "You said I could use it in emergencies, right? Well, this counts." Jim blinked, unsure whether to laugh or argue. "This isn't exactly an emergency," he replied, gesturing toward her sparkling car. "That water's meant for crops and livestock, not car washes." Karen shrugged, unfazed by his concern. "Relax, Jim. It's not like you're running out anytime soon. Besides, my well's acting up again, so I needed a backup plan." She flashed him a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You're welcome to come over and check it out if you want." Jim bit back a retort, knowing it wouldn't do any good to escalate things. Instead, he nodded stiffly and returned to his truck, frustration simmering beneath the surface. Over the next few weeks, Karen's behavior only grew worse. Every time Jim drove by her house, he saw her using the water for one thing or another. Sometimes it was filling kiddie pools for her kids. Other times it was watering her patchy lawn, which looked more brown than green no matter how much effort she put into it. Once, he even caught her hosting a barbecue, with guests freely using his water to rinse plates and cool drinks. Each time Jim confronted her, Karen brushed him off with vague promises to stop. "I'll be more careful," she'd say, or "Don't worry, I'm almost done." But the truth was painfully obvious. Karen had no intention of changing her ways. She acted as though the water belonged to her, treating it like an endless resource rather than the precious commodity it truly was. The breaking point came one sweltering afternoon when Jim noticed an alarming drop in the water supply reaching his cattle. Panic set in as he rushed to investigate. Following the pipeline, he discovered something that made his blood boil. Karen hadn't just tapped into his water line temporarily. She had installed a permanent connection, rerouting gallons upon gallons straight to her property. It was brazen, disrespectful, and completely unacceptable. Standing there, staring at the makeshift tap jutting out of his pipeline, Jim felt a mix of selfishness and entitlement crashing down on him. This wasn't just about water anymore. It was about respect, boundaries, and the values he held dear. Something had to change, but Jim wasn't sure yet how far he was willing to go to make that happen. Karen's actions became bolder with each passing day, as if she were deliberately testing how far she could push Jim before he snapped. It wasn't just the water usage anymore. It was her attitude, her blatant disregard for his property and his livelihood. Jim tried reasoning with her again and again, hoping that a calm conversation might make her see the harm she was causing. But every attempt ended the same way. Karen nodding absently, promising to cut back, and then continuing exactly as she had been. One particularly frustrating evening, Jim stood in Karen's driveway, watching her fill yet another kiddie pool for her children. The late afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty ground. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, though he did his best to keep his voice steady. "Karen," he said firmly, "you can't keep doing this. That water is for my ranch, for my animals, my crops, everything I depend on. If you need help with your well, we can figure something out, but you can't just take what isn't yours." Karen barely looked up from her task. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, she replied, "Oh, come on, Jim. You're acting like I'm draining the entire aquifer. It's just a little water. You act like it's the end of the world." Her tone was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge to it that grated on Jim's nerves. She clearly didn't understand, or didn't care, how much effort went into maintaining the ranch's delicate balance. The tension between them grew thicker with each interaction. Neighbors began to notice the strained dynamic, whispering about the situation when they thought Jim or Karen weren't listening. Some sympathized with Jim, knowing how hard he worked to sustain the ranch. Others sided with Karen, thinking maybe Jim was being too strict. After all, she had moved from the city, where resources like water flowed freely without much thought. To them, it seemed understandable that she'd struggle to adjust to rural life. But no one saw the full extent of the damage Karen was causing, not until the drought hit. Summers in Texas were always scorching, but this year felt especially brutal. The heat baked the earth, turning once lush fields brittle and brown. Nearby farms started rationing their water supplies, desperate to stretch what little they had left. On Jim's ranch, things weren't much better. The cattle grew restless, panting under the relentless sun, while the crops wilted despite his best efforts to save them. And still, Karen persisted. Every time Jim drove past her house, he saw evidence of her wastefulness. Sprinklers running during the hottest part of the day, muddy puddles forming where her kids played, and yes, her spotless Mercedes gleaming in the driveway. It was maddening. Here he was, struggling to keep his ranch alive, while she squandered his water like it was infinite. Finally, after weeks of simmering frustration, Jim decided to take matters into his own hands. He followed the pipeline one morning, determined to find out exactly how much water Karen was siphoning off. What he discovered shocked him. Hidden behind a cluster of bushes near the property line, Karen had installed not just a tap, but an entire secondary valve system. It allowed her to divert water directly to her house without anyone noticing. The setup was clever, almost professional, which made it even more infuriating. This wasn't a casual oversight. It was calculated theft. Standing there, staring at the tangled mess of pipes, Jim felt a mix of anger and betrayal wash over him. He had trusted Karen, offered her help when she needed it, and this was how she repaid him. The injustice burned in his chest, fueling a growing desire to teach her a lesson she wouldn't soon forget. For days, Jim wrestled with his emotions, torn between confronting her outright and letting the authorities handle it. But deep down, he knew neither option would satisfy him. Something inside him wanted Karen to experience firsthand what it felt like to have her comfort disrupted, to feel the sting of losing something she took for granted. As the idea began to form in his mind, Jim couldn't shake the image of Karen's pristine car drenched in filth, her smug expression melting into horror. It was reckless, perhaps even cruel, but the thought brought him a twisted sense of satisfaction. He told himself it wasn't revenge, it was justice. Whatever it was, Jim knew one thing for certain. Karen's days of exploiting his water were numbered. Late one restless night, Jim sat alone on his porch, staring out at the vast expanse of his ranch. The stars above twinkled faintly, their light dimmed by the oppressive heat that lingered even after sunset. Crickets chirped in the distance, and the occasional hoot of an owl broke the silence. Normally, this was when Jim felt most at peace, the quiet moments where he could reflect on the day's work and let the worries of the world fade away. But tonight, his mind raced with thoughts of Karen and her relentless misuse of his water. He replayed every conversation they'd had, every promise she'd broken, and every drop of water she'd wasted. Each memory stoked the fire of resentment burning inside him. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about respect. She treated his generosity like a free pass, taking without asking and showing no gratitude. And now, with the drought worsening and his own resources stretched thin, her actions felt like a personal attack on everything he held dear. As he leaned back in his chair, absently tapping his boot against the wooden floorboards, an idea began to form, a dark, dangerous idea. At first, Jim dismissed it as absurd. "No," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "I'm not that kind of person." But the more he thought about it, the more appealing it became. What if he could give Karen a taste of her own medicine? Something so shocking, so disgusting, that she'd finally understand the consequences of her selfishness. His gaze drifted toward the barn, where large tanks of slaughterhouse waste were stored. The ranch occasionally received deliveries of this nutrient-rich byproduct, which Jim used sparingly as fertilizer for certain fields. It smelled terrible, like rotting eggs mixed with spoiled meat, and left a greasy residue wherever it touched. Even seasoned farmers avoided handling it unless absolutely necessary. To anyone unfamiliar with its purpose, it looked and smelled like pure filth. Jim's lips curled into a sly grin as the plan crystallized in his mind. If Karen wanted water so badly, why not give her something closer to what she deserved? He imagined the look on her face when she turned on her faucet only to be greeted by a gush of foul-smelling sludge. The image brought him a twisted sense of satisfaction, though a small voice in the back of his mind warned him that this was a slippery slope. The next morning, Jim woke up determined. He told himself it wasn't revenge, it was a lesson. People like Karen needed to learn boundaries, and sometimes drastic measures were required. Besides, once she realized the error of her ways, he could always switch the water back and pretend nothing had happened. No harm, no foul. Right. That afternoon, Jim gathered the tools he'd need: wrenches, pipes, and a roll of duct tape. Under the pretense of routine maintenance, he set to work rerouting the pipeline. His hands moved quickly, fueled by a mix of anger and nervous energy. He disconnected the freshwater line leading to Karen's property and replaced it with a secondary pipe connected to the tank of Slaughterhouse waste. The process took longer than expected, but by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, everything was in place. Standing back to admire his handiwork, Jim felt a strange cocktail of emotions swirling inside him. Part of him was proud of his ingenuity. Another part was uneasy about crossing such a moral line. Still, there was no turning back now. All that remained was to wait and see how Karen would react. As he walked back to the house, wiping grease-stained hands on his jeans, Jim couldn't help but smile at the irony of it all. For months, she had taken advantage of his kindness without a second thought. Now she was about to get exactly what she deserved, or so he believed. Little did Jim know, his decision would set off a chain reaction neither he nor Karen could have anticipated. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that usually filled Jim with a sense of calm and purpose. But today was different. As he sipped his coffee on the porch, his eyes kept darting toward Karen's driveway, anticipation bubbling in his chest. He tried to act normal, going about his usual chores, feeding the cattle, checking the irrigation system, but his mind was elsewhere. Every sound, every movement seemed louder, more significant. Finally, just after noon, he saw her SUV pull into the driveway. Karen stepped out wearing her signature oversized sunglasses and a breezy sundress, looking every bit the picture of someone who hadn't a care in the world. She grabbed a bucket and sponge from the garage and headed straight for her Mercedes, which gleamed under the midday sun. Jim watched from afar, his heart pounding as she turned on the faucet. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, with a gush, the liquid shot out of the hose. And it wasn't water. It was thick, dark, and smelled absolutely putrid. The noxious stream splattered across the hood of her car, leaving streaks of brownish slime that oozed down the pristine white surface. Karen froze, her mouth dropping open in horror. She dropped the hose, stumbling backward as the foul-smelling substance pooled at her feet. Her designer sandals were instantly soaked, and the smell hit her like a punch to the gut. What is this?" she shrieked, gagging as she waved a hand in front of her face. Her voice carried across the field, loud enough for Jim to hear even from his porch. He couldn't help but chuckle quietly, though he quickly stifled it when he realized how childish it made him feel. Still, the sight of Karen, her perfectly styled hair now frizzing in the humid air, her expensive dress spattered with filth, was almost poetic justice. Neighbors began to gather, drawn by the commotion. Some covered their noses against the stench, while others openly laughed at the absurdity of it all. One elderly rancher leaned on his fence post, shaking his head and muttering, "Well, serves her right." Karen's face turned beet red as she realized she was the center of attention. For someone who prided herself on appearances, this was nothing short of a nightmare. Still reeling from shock, Karen stormed across the field toward Jim's house, her heels sinking into the dirt with each angry step. By the time she reached his porch, she was fuming, her face streaked with grime and her clothes ruined. "What did you do?" she demanded, pointing an accusatory finger at him. "This is disgusting. You ruined my car, my shoes, everything." Jim feigned confusion, raising his hands defensively. "Whoa, slow down," he said, struggling to keep a straight face. "I didn't do anything. Maybe your well's contaminated or something." "My well? Are you serious?" Karen screeched, throwing her arms up in frustration. "You know exactly what's going on here. That's your water line. I followed it myself. Don't play dumb with me, Jim." Her accusations hung heavy in the air, but Jim stood firm, refusing to admit anything. Inside, though, guilt gnawed at him. Seeing her so humiliated should have felt satisfying, but instead it left a bitter taste in his mouth. Was this really who he wanted to be, the kind of person who stooped to such levels just to make a point? As Karen continued ranting, pacing back and forth on his porch like a caged animal, Jim found himself tuning her out. His thoughts drifted to the bigger picture. Yes, Karen had crossed a line, but so had he. What started as a lesson had spiraled into something much darker, something that could damage not only his reputation, but also his relationships with the community. And for what? A fleeting moment of revenge. By the time Karen finally stomped off, threatening to call a lawyer and report him to the authorities, Jim felt drained. Watching her retreating figure, now coated in the very mess she had caused, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fallout from Karen's ruined car wash spread faster than wildfire through the small rural community. By the next morning, everyone seemed to know about the bizarre incident. Some folks whispered behind closed doors, while others didn't bother hiding their opinions. At Hank's feed store, where farmers and ranchers gathered to buy supplies and swap stories, Jim overheard snippets of conversation as he picked up a bag of feed. "Can you believe what happened to Karen?" One man chuckled, shaking his head. "Serves her right for being so careless." Another chimed in. "Still, swapping water with whatever that stuff was. That's cold, even for Jim." Jim kept his head down, pretending not to hear. He paid for his supplies quickly and left, avoiding eye contact with anyone. But the weight of their judgment followed him home. For the first time in years, he felt out of place in his own community. A man who had always been respected now seen as someone who had crossed a line. Karen wasted no time escalating the situation. The very next day, she hired a lawyer and filed a formal complaint against Jim, accusing him of sabotage and property damage. Word of the lawsuit reached Jim via a certified letter delivered to his mailbox. As he read the official-looking document, his stomach sank. This wasn't just a neighborhood feud anymore. It was legal trouble, and it carried real consequences. If found guilty, Jim could face hefty fines or even jail time. Worse still, the publicity might tarnish his family's good name, something he'd worked so hard to uphold. Local authorities launched an investigation, questioning both Jim and Karen extensively. They inspected the pipelines, tested samples of the foul liquid that had poured onto Karen's driveway, and interviewed neighbors who had witnessed the growing tension between the two. Jim played dumb throughout the process, insisting he had no idea how Slaughterhouse waste ended up in Karen's water supply. "I swear, I haven't touched those pipes," he told the investigator, trying to sound convincing despite the knot tightening in his chest. Maybe it was a mistake during delivery or something. While there wasn't enough concrete evidence to charge Jim criminally, the ordeal took its toll. Rumors swirled, painting him as either a victim of Karen's antics or a vindictive neighbor pushed too far. Some people distanced themselves, unsure which side to take. Others openly criticized him, saying they expected better from someone like Jim. Even close friends hesitated to speak up, leaving him feeling isolated and misunderstood. At night, Jim lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the events in his mind. He thought about the choices he'd made, the anger that had clouded his judgment, the satisfaction he'd felt watching Karen squirm, and the guilt that followed. Was this worth it? Had teaching her a lesson truly justified risking his reputation and peace of mind? The more he reflected, the clearer it became. Revenge wasn't sweet. It was messy, complicated, and ultimately unsatisfying. One evening, as Jim sat on his porch nursing a cup of coffee, an older neighbor named Earl stopped by unannounced. Earl had lived in the area longer than anyone else and was known for his wisdom and calm demeanor. After exchanging pleasantries, Earl got straight to the point. "Look, son," he said, leaning on his cane, "I'm not here to judge you. We all make mistakes when we're backed into a corner. But holding on to anger, letting it control your actions, that's poison. You've got a good heart, Jim. Don't let this thing eat away at you." Earl's words lingered long after he left. Jim realized that while Karen's behavior had been selfish and disrespectful, his response hadn't been much better. Two wrongs didn't make a right, and now he was paying the price, not just legally but emotionally. The ranch, once a source of pride and joy, felt heavier somehow, burdened by the conflict that refused to fade. As days turned into weeks, Jim began taking steps to repair the damage, not just to his property, but also to his relationships. He installed locks and security measures on his water lines, ensuring no one could tamper with them again. He apologized to neighbors who had grown distant, explaining that he regretted letting things escalate. And though Karen remained adamant about pursuing legal action, Jim vowed to handle the matter maturely, seeking advice from a lawyer to protect himself without retaliating further. Through it all, one truth became undeniable. Revenge may have given him momentary satisfaction, but it came at a cost far greater than he'd anticipated. In the end, Karen didn't stick around to see the lawsuit through. Whether it was the mounting embarrassment of her public humiliation or the realization that rural life wasn't for her, she packed up her belongings and moved back to the city within a month. Her gleaming Mercedes, once the centerpiece of her driveway, was sold at a steep discount after multiple attempts to clean off the stubborn stains proved futile. Neighbors whispered that she traded it in for a modest sit-in, though no one could confirm if that was true. Either way, Karen's departure marked the beginning of a quieter chapter for Jim and the community. Without Karen's constant drama, life on the ranch slowly returned to its peaceful rhythm. The cattle grazed lazily under the wide-open skies, and the fields began to recover from the drought. Jim worked tirelessly to repair not only his water lines, but also the relationships he had strained during the conflict. He hosted a small barbecue for his neighbors, serving homemade brisket and apologizing for any trouble his actions might have caused. "I let my temper get the best of me," he admitted humbly. "That's not who I want to be." To his relief, most people accepted his apology, understanding that everyone makes mistakes when pushed too far. Some even admitted they'd been secretly rooting for him all along, though they warned him against taking such drastic measures in the future. "We're all human, Jim," one neighbor said with a grin. "But next time, maybe just cut her water line instead of turning her car into a science experiment." The legal battle fizzled out shortly after Karen left. With her gone, there was little motivation to pursue the case further, and the authorities eventually closed the investigation due to lack of evidence. While Jim dodged criminal charges, the experience left an indelible mark on him. He realized how close he had come to losing everything, not just legally but personally. It forced him to reevaluate his priorities and commit to handling conflicts differently moving forward. Jim also made practical changes to ensure nothing like this could happen again. He upgraded his pipeline system, installing tamper-proof locks and surveillance cameras to monitor access points. He even consulted with a local engineer to design a more secure irrigation setup, ensuring his precious water supply would remain protected. These improvements came at a cost, but Jim saw them as an investment in the ranch's future and his own peace of mind. As months passed, the story of Karen, and the slaughterhouse waste became something of a legend in the area. Newcomers to the community would hear about it at gatherings, often met with laughter and headshakes. "You should have seen her face," someone would say, mimicking Karen's horrified reaction. While the tale brought humor, it also served as a cautionary reminder about respecting boundaries and resources, a lesson both Karen and Jim had learned the hard way. For Jim, the incident stayed with him long after the dust settled. It shaped how he interacted with others, teaching him the importance of patience, communication, and forgiveness. He came to understand that anger, while natural, is a poor guide for decision-making. Revenge might offer fleeting satisfaction, but it rarely solves problems, and often creates new ones. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, Jim stood on his porch watching the sunrise. The air smelled fresh, carrying the earthy scent of fall. For the first time in months, he felt truly at ease. The ranch was thriving, his neighbors were supportive, and the weight of resentment no longer hung over him. Life wasn't perfect. It never was, but it was good. And sometimes, that was enough. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Jim smiled to himself. He knew he'd made mistakes, but he also knew he was better for having faced them. The ranch, much like its caretaker, had weathered the storm and emerged stronger on the other side. And deep down, Jim believed that was what mattered most. Learning, growing, and finding balance, even when life threw chaos his way.